Welcome back, everyone, to Bobby Fischer's My 60 Memorable Games, Game 1, Fischer versus Sherwin, 1957. So we had just finished off with Sherwin playing his famous but puzzling rook to b8 move, which Fischer famously writes that he made with his pinky as if to emphasize the cunning of this mysterious move. So with that, Fischer decides to move rook e1, then pawn to d6. Now you see that black, with his two pawns here on d6 and e6, he has a Scheveningen small center kind of set up. And then Fischer moves to c3. I was very happy to guess this move when I was going over the game because obviously white at some point needs to be fighting for this d4 square. So he's now fighting for a share of the d4 square, and then a pawn push is probably going to come eventually. And then at this point, Sherwin plays pawn to b6, preparing to fianchetto his dark squared bishop. Now, Fischer writes, not bad, but I had expected something differently. He had expected something more along the lines of pawn to b5 to push along the queen side, and then he would have played pawn to d4, c takes d4, or if instead of b4, then he would have played e5 and then bishop takes c3, etc. But in this position, if you can refrain from looking at the annotations, Fischer was saying that this particular position actually wins a piece for black. If you try to play b4, e5, and then he plays bishop takes c3, this position is an error and it loses a piece for black. So I'd like you to take a moment to see if you can find the tactic in this position. How does black lose a piece in this position? So please pause the video, see if you can find what Fischer is pointing out to. Okay, so the variation, if it gets to this point, is e takes f6, and then c takes d2, and knight takes d2 wins a piece. Because by taking back on d2, we now have a dual threat. This fianchettoed bishop is now attacking the hanging knight on c6, while this pawn is still on f6, threatening the e7 bishop. And there is no way to save them both simultaneously. But Fischer says that if you play instead a stronger d takes e5, knight d7, that white still holds the advantage. Or something more like d4 and then c takes d4 and then c takes d4, d5, this has a quality for black. So he had expected a line starting with b5 instead of b6, which he says is not bad, but there are some different things that go on. So at this point in the position, Sherwin has played b6 and he's preparing to fianchetto his bishop. And Fischer follows that up with an immediate d4. I must admit that I was not expecting that in this position. I didn't think he would push d4 right away. I thought maybe he might prepare it first with something like knight to f1 to put another supporter on the d4 pawn, but that's not really necessary in this position. If he already has two defenders on d4, if he pushes to d4, so he pushes d4 right away. And then Sherwin plays queen to c7. And Fischer labels this a mistake, and he says, this move leads to trouble. Black should strive for counterplay by opening up on the c file. He suggests instead, as an alternative to c7, he suggests c takes d4, c takes d4, d5, e5, knight d7, and says, etc. And he says, by opening up the c file, black should try to get his rooks on that open file and look for counterplay in the center, look for counterplay on that c file on the queen side, because it's clear that white's pieces are aiming for the king side. This position is still better for white, even though Fischer says this position is better than what black chooses, because you can already see where this is going. The pieces of white are already aiming towards getting to this king side, right? We know the knight is going to want to somehow, presumably, the pawn will go to h4, and then after the pawn goes to h4, the knight is going to maneuver a series of maneuvers to the king side. The bishop is already aimed the king side. The queen is going to be headed over there. The rooks eventually are going to try to get over there on the files. We see all of this coming. In the meantime, it's going to be more difficult for black to get defenders over there, because as you see, this advanced e5 pawn is trying to keep black off of f6, and with this pawn formation, with the e6 and the d5 pawn, black's light squared bishop is not going to be so easily getting into the game. The only move where it can exercise any influence here is bishop to a6. So it looks like that white has a leg up in terms of a more long-term positional attack, but that's still better than queen c7, which Fischer suggests, because black is not taking the time to open the c file. What he's doing is he is giving white time to attack the king side, and he's not opening up any avenues for black to get any counterplay. So Fischer then plays e5. He gives that move an exclamation point, and then he goes knight d5. And Fischer gives a whole bunch of variations of different things that are worse. Instead of knight, so clearly the knight has to move, or the pawn has to be captured. The knight is under threat. So one variation is knight d7, and then e takes d6, bishop takes d6, knight e4, getting the knight more developed and hitting the bishop. C takes d4, knight takes d6, queen takes d6, bishop f4, e5, knight takes e5, knight takes c5, c takes d4, and that wins a pawn. Also, another try is instead d takes e5, and then the best try, d takes e5, knight d7, queen e2, bishop b7, h4. And here, Fischer says he has a bind, meaning that he has a good job of putting his position to try to keep black in place, but he says black's game still might be tenable. So he's saying that knight d5 is not as bad as knight d7, but he thinks the best try is to be in this position, where even though white has a bind on black, there might be a tenable. So anyway, to continue the game, he's moved knight d5, and then white plays e takes d6, bishop takes d6, knight e4, and then black plays c4. And Fischer writes, an unpleasant choice, since it releases pressure in the center and gives white a free hand on the king side. But, however, after other moves, black simply loses material. And I actually saw this. I was feeling very proud of myself. I saw the reason why c4 was necessary, because after e4, things start to get complicated. Let's go back for a moment, all the way back to queen c7. If you ever think about what you should do every single time you move, you should ask yourself a series of questions. One of the questions you ask is, what are my opponent's threats? Another question you ask is, what are the geometric consequences of this last move? And one thing that we can notice all the way back from queen c7 is that at this point, the queen on c7 is now on the same dark square diagonal, this h2 to b8 dark square diagonal as his b8 rook. So there is now a potential skewer there. And even though in this position, because you have these Scheveningen pawns in the way, just because that's not a tactical consideration now, doesn't mean it's not a tactical consideration in the future. So as we move forward in the game and we see the necessity of c4, what we realize is that in this position, white is in a position to trade his e4 knight for black's d6 bishop. And once he does that, all of a sudden now we still have this potential skewer, this with this dark square diagonal. We still have this potential skewer here. But at that point, the knight's control over the f4 square becomes critical. So if white could get, say, this move in, so for example, let's just assume for a moment that we enter in a null move. So if we enter a null move here, so black doesn't get to move, and now it's just white to move. One of the things that white can do is very simple. Knight takes bishop, queen takes knight, and then now white can play c4, and there is no way for black to keep up his pressure on that square, because now the knight has to move. And so let's say he goes to f6, and now bishop f4. And you can't just interpose because of the pawn fork. And so let's say, even if the knight goes back to say there instead, and then bishop f4, you still have this very problematic skewer. So if nothing else, he's going to be losing material one way or the other. But that's if a null move. So we see that the whole purpose behind c4 is the very idea that there is a danger for tactics along that diagonal. And so even though this c4 move, it ends up kind of congesting black's position and giving white a free hand to start kingside operations, Sherwin already has to be concerned about the potential tactics of a c4 push. So we are going to further examine what worse things can happen as we move into part 3.